Hey kids, I think we can all agree that planes are pretty cool. They probably seem like a pretty normal part of life living in modern times, but if you hopped in a time machine and tried to convince some 12th century peasants that your 183-ton hunk of metal is capable of flight, they'd probably burn you for witchcraft. Well, they wouldn't be far off, because the key to heavier than air flight is witchcraft, also known as physics and fluid dynamics. The design of the rigid airplane all started when an inventor and engineer named George Cayley thought to himself, "Man, ornithopters are dumb. Flapping your wings super fast probably isn't the best way to get around." So in 1799, he made the first concept for a rigid winged aircraft, becoming the first aeronautical engineer. Da Vinci was definitely onto something, but he was limited by the technology and knowledge of the Renaissance period. Arguably Cayley's biggest contribution, though, was the discovery that earned him his nickname the Father of Aviation, which was identifying the four main forces involved in flight, which are lift, thrust, drag, and weight, which is gravity. Today we're going to stand on the shoulders of Cayley's and build our very own flying machine. To do so, we're going to have to pay close attention to these four forces if we want our plane to fly. The most important force in aviation is lift, as it's responsible for both a plane's upward and forward force, which is thrust. The force of lift is generated when a specially shaped object, called an airfoil, collides with a fluid, which means a liquid or a gas. Basically, when you have a big body of fluid like the open air, it moves in a flow, which can be represented with streamlines, a line that is tangential to the direction of the air particle's instantaneous velocity vector. These lines are disrupted by the presence of an object, and the way the object affects the flow is crucial to generating lift. There are two explanations behind the forces of lift. The first involves what happens to the streamlines before and after they make contact with the airfoil. You can see that the streamlines are bent upwards toward the leading edge and downwards off the trailing edge. These effects, called upwash and downwash, are a result of circulation on the airfoil. Because the downwards turn is greater than the upwards turn, this means that the airfoil's net turning of flow is downwards. In other words, the airfoil exerts a downward force on the air. Because of Newton's third law, this means that the air must also exert an upwards force on the airfoil, which explains lift. The second explanation is more complex and involves the work of a man named Daniel Bernoulli. Bernoulli was a very important person in the world of mathematics and physics and is recognized as a pioneer in fluid mechanics. In 1738, he discovered that an increase in a fluid's velocity results in a decrease in its pressure, and vice versa, a phenomenon now called Bernoulli's principle. Due to viscosity, as the streamlines leave the trailing edge, a vortex begins to form, which rotates in a counterclockwise direction. To satisfy the conservation of momentum, there must be an opposite rotational effect, which forms a circulation around the airfoil. We can calculate how much circulation is required to balance out the vortex's angular momentum, called the Cotta condition. So we know that the flow around an airfoil can be shown through a combination of idealized uniform irrotational flow and circulatory flow. The circulation's velocity vectors combine with the velocity of uniform irrotational flow, acting to speed up the airflow above and slow down the airflow below, which, in accordance with Bernoulli's principle, creates a low-pressure zone on top of the airfoil and a high-pressure zone below. This difference in pressure is the reason for the upward force in the airfoil. We can generate more or less lift based on the angle of the airfoil turning the airflow, which is called the angle of attack. This also helps us roll the plane by using ailerons with variable angles of attack to generate more or less lift on either side of the plane. Our simulation provides us with an airfoil block which, depending on the angle of attack, generates variable lift when in motion. For our plane's wings, we'll be using a bunch of these babies in tandem. To generate lift, there has to be motion between the object and the air, leading us to the next most important force, the one engineers, more specifically the Wright brothers, struggled with the most: thrust. For propeller planes, thrust is generated with spinning airfoils, called propeller blades, that function similar to the wings of a plane, but the motion between the airfoil and the air is generated through rotation. The idea of lift through rotational motion was first conceptualized by Leonardo da Vinci, who, way back in 1489, armed with only style, conceived a hypothetical machine that was similar in function to a modern helicopter. Unfortunately, his designs were limited by the knowledge and technology of the time, but he was definitely onto something. Anyway, think about a propeller as a sideways plane wing. So instead of the pressure difference between the top and bottom pushing the plane upwards, it's between the front and back, so lift acts to propel the plane forwards. The design of propellers wasn't an easy task, and was something that the Wright brothers struggled with for a while. Using data from their wind tunnel experiments on wing shape, they designed propellers that were similar in shape to wings, yet accounted for airflow on both the X and Z axis. So for our propeller, we're going to use 4 airfoils connected to our engine, which generates rotational motion. The conservation of angular momentum still applies here. Because our engine generates such great rotational motion, the rest of the plane will begin to spin in the opposite direction of their propeller to counteract this. To nullify this effect and give the plane even more lift, we'll use a second propeller spinning opposite to the first. This step balances out the rotational momentum while providing even more lift. The third force we need to deal with is drag. Since a plane is a massive object moving through fluid at very high speeds, it's going to meet a lot of resistance from the air. There are also 2 reasons for this. The first is because of something called skin friction between the molecules of the air and the molecules of the plane. The molecules face resistance as they move against each other because of the peak and valley-like structures that collide with each other and resist motion. Because friction has such an effect, the drag can be reduced by using smooth, waxed surfaces. The second reason behind drag is called form drag, which is resistance due to the plane's shape. When air molecules flow around an object, their velocities and pressure are changed. And a change in pressure means a change in momentum of the gas, and because a change in momentum results in a force, the plane is pushed, slowing it down. This effect can be minimized using an aerodynamic shape, or a shape that allows air to flow around it with maximum ease. Speaking of thrust, another huge problem the Wright brothers faced was achieving the balance between engine power and engine weight, as most sufficiently powerful engines would weigh too much for a flimsy wooden prototype. In physics terms, the thrust force did not create enough motion between the wings in the air to generate enough lift to counteract the force of gravity of a heavy engine. After a lot of research and experimentation, they finally found a balance, coming up with a 4-cylinder engine that produced 16 horsepower, which was reduced to 12 in practice because the heat would decrease the efficiency, and weighed in at 180 pounds. With this, on December 17, 1903, the Wright Flyer became the first successful plane flight. Luckily, we can make a pretty powerful engine with some physics engine hijinks, stacking a bunch of wheels on top of each other so that their rotational motion stacks. The last force we have to manage is gravity. Hopefully, gravity is self-explanatory, being the gravitational attraction between Earth and our plane. Weight is a super important factor when it comes to designing a plane. Not just how much the thing weighs, but also where the weight is on the plane. Things have to be pretty symmetrical, at least along the roll axis, or else your plane will be tilting and turning on its own. For a constant, steady flight, these 4 forces have to be balanced with their counterparts. The upward force of lift has to be equal and opposite to the downward force of gravity. The forward force of thrust must be equal and opposite to the backwards force of drag. To do fancy stuff like turning and taking off, all you have to do is unbalance these forces. When taking off, a plane's thrust has to overpower friction with the ground and drag, though because drag is proportional to the plane's velocity, it's not at full force until the plane has accelerated. Turning in the air isn't much like turning a car on the ground. To turn in a plane, you have to be able to roll, so that the lift force is no longer straight up, and acts as the centripetal force to circular motion. To achieve this, we use nifty little things called ailerons that I mentioned earlier, which are essentially just mini wings that can rotate to generate more or less lift. If you wanted to turn to the right, for example, the ailerons on the right wing would tilt down, and the left ailerons would tilt up. This means that the left side of the plane generates more lift than the right side. As a result, the plane rolls, and circular motion begins. We can use the same principle for control on the pitch axis by channeling air upwards or downwards on the tail of the plane to tilt the nose down. Because flying in a straight line is boring, we need to give our plane some turning capabilities. To do this, many of the aileron blocks on our wings are attached to machines that let them rotate. The rudder also has the ability to turn the plane, but rather than banking, instead acts kind of like a ship's rudder, but channels the flow of air instead of water. So our plane has enough thrust to overcome drag and enough lift to counteract its mass. It's fitted out with everything we need for a stable flight, like the stabilizers in the back, rotating ailerons on the tail to give us control of the pitch axis, and rotating ailerons on the wings to give us control on the roll axis. So let's test it out. And we have flight. Because our plane's motion is constant, we know that its forces are balanced. If we want to accelerate, slow down, turn, or change pitch, all we need to do is unbalance these forces. Well, we did it. Goes to show you don't need some fancy pants degree to design a working plane. All you need are some NASA documents and a YouTube tutorial. I'll see you in the air, fellas.